We do not understand God's reckoning of time, but we also have been shut out from understanding the feast of the Lord, which the New Testament says are all shadow pictures of good things to come.
The Prophecies in the Feast of the Lord, presented by Michael Rood.
Shalom. This is Michael Rood at Ophel Gardens on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. We are living in God's universe. The world in which we live is synchronized to God's calendar and His time clock. The sun and moon are entwined in an intricate balance of natural law that is far more accurate than the cogs, gears, and springs in the finest Swiss watch. The passage of days, weeks, months, and years continue to be reckoned by the Almighty just as they have from the beginning. Whether we understand the Creator's reckoning of time or not does not alter His plans in the least. His reckoning of time is clearly detailed in the Hebrew Scriptures, but the Western world has completely forsaken God's reckoning of time and has adopted a pagan calendar in which every day of the week and every month of the year is named after a different pagan god or fallen angel. Days, weeks, months, and years all begin and end at completely fictitious points in time. It is as if the hands have been broken from the face of the clock. We have no idea what time it is, but the Creator knows, and He does not want His children to be ignorant of His times and His seasons. We are going back to Bereshit, back to the beginning, to Genesis, to rediscover God's reckoning of time. Isaiah the prophet said that Yahweh is great, far above all the mighty ones of the earth, telling the end from the very beginning, from Genesis. And from ancient times, He has declared the things that are not yet as though they have already transpired. He has already told us the end from the beginning in the times and seasons of the Lord. Join us in the Lester Summerall television studios, where this multimedia presentation on the prophecies and the Feast of the Lord was recorded before the Bible prophecy students assembled by the Prophecy Club. This is Bible Prophecy 101. Now, Episode 6 in the 26-part series on the prophecies and the Feast of the Lord. We are living in God's universe.
In Genesis 1:14 we go back, and God said, "Let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years." God's reckoning of time is governed by the movement of the heavenly bodies. And in order to understand God's reckoning of time, now we go to the biblical Hebrew calendar. And now this is not the modern Jewish calendar. The modern Jewish calendar is based on the astronomical calculations of Rabbi Hillel II in the 4th century. And even though those calculations were very accurate at the time, they were not accurate enough so that they would remain on track over the 1,600 years that it has been in use. So most of the time we're celebrating the feast on the wrong day according to God's original reckoning of time. Now that we're back in the land, however, we can go back to God's original reckoning of time, and I personally believe that God runs the universe on His calendar, whether or not we understand or even recognize God's calendar. I believe that God's feast days will be fulfilled according to His prophetic calendar and not according to any of our own misunderstanding. And so it is this biblical Hebrew calendar that I'm going to begin to explain so that you understand how these charts work and to understand the calendar. And we see that in this biblical Hebrew calendar, right up at the top, we're going to take you to the beginning of the year. And first of all, to understand God's reckoning as it's laid out right in the book of Genesis, in the first chapter we see when days begin according to God's reckoning of time. Days begin when the sun sets, at sunset. Doesn't matter what time it is, because every day it's different. It's different in Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. It's whenever the sun sets, that is when the day begins. When do weeks begin? Weeks begin at sunset at the end of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is Friday evening when the sun goes down until Saturday evening when the sun goes down. As the sun sets at the end of the Shabbat, at the end of Sabbath, that is the first day of the week. And that's why when we read in the book of the Acts of the Jewish apostles, how that the disciples got together early on the first day of the week to break bread, that Shaul began teaching, and he taught late into the night until this young man fell out of the window. They ran out there, he was dead. They prayed for him, he was raised from the dead, and then everyone was so pumped up then, nobody could go to sleep all night long. And so when the sun came up, Shaul took off with his entourage and took off on their next journey, and everyone else went to work. See, in the Western Gentile Christian world, when people read early the first day of the week, they got together to break bread, they immediately think they got up real early on Sunday morning and had some kind of special brunch. Only in your Western Gentile mind. What they were doing was the third meal of Shabbat, the meal at the end of the Sabbath, in which after having a whole day of resting in the Sabbath, in studying the Scriptures, and being refueled by God, and eating of the bread of life, then at the end of the day, what we do is still this very day in the city of Jerusalem, then we leave our homes, we get together in larger groups around the table, everyone brings food. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Everyone brings food together, everyone eats together, and there everyone shares with each other. Everyone has a psalm, a hymn, a doctrine, a revelation. Look what the Lord showed me. And they minister to each other, and we drag that meal out until the wee hours of the morning sometimes. Nobody wants it to end. The Sabbath is such a blessing that God gave to us right in the very beginning. In Genesis, He set it apart, He sanctified it, He made it holy, and He said, keep it holy. And when that culture does this, in which everyone then participates and they get refueled and they read the Scripture, then when they get together, they've got something to share. They're not coming together as a bunch of needy basket cases in which you have to have a paid professional attempt to raise you from the dead 1 hour a week. There's no minister that gets paid enough to raise the dead 1 hour a week or is really that good at it, because everyone is supposed to minister to each other. And so we see in the first century believers getting together, that they got together, they broke bread, and they just shared late into the middle of the night until someone falls out the window and is taken up dead. I believe that's why windows were created, to keep kids from falling out late at the early the first day of the week in the middle of the night. So there it is, to where we have to have a perspective of the first century church, understanding these are Jews that are getting together like they have been for all these decades and doing the very same things. And we see that it's such a healthy thing that all the synagogues started in the home. The early believers all got together in the home. It was Constantine that started building cathedrals, setting theater style, and having a paid professional up front. So that's whenever the form does not allow the body of believers to function with everyone as a minister, then the form is wrong. Now this is a good form here tonight to disseminate a lot of information. But this is how the assembly operates and ministers to each other. I can minister this way, but it has to be a sharing, a full sharing of everyone ministering to each other, everyone growing up in the fullness and stature of the Messiah. And that's what the goal is. Enough preaching, let's get back to the calendar. When do months begin, according to God's reckoning of time? Months begin when the first sliver of the new moon appears. And there is a mikra, or a rehearsal, that is done so that you know how that is established. But basically, when the first sliver of the new moon appears, that's the first day of the month. Then the moon waxes full about mid-month, then it wanes to where there is no moon, and then when the first sliver of the next new moon appears, that is the beginning of the month. And so we see that the lunar cycle, or the monthly cycle, is exactly 29.530587 days long, which means you either have a 29-day month or a 30-day month, one or the other, depending on the visible sighting of the first sliver of the new moon. Now, the next question would be, when do years begin? And to see when years begin, first of all, I would like you to look at the chart and to see the month of the Abib. As it is written in the King James, in the English version, it says the month of Abib. In Hebrew, it would be pronounced Aviv, and so you'll see that sometimes I write it Abib, sometimes I write it Aviv. After the Babylonian captivity, it was renamed as the month of Nisan. And the month of the Aviv is generally the first new moon after the vernal equinox, but that's not how it is determined. We're going to see that God's reckoning allows us to understand when the year begins and see that when we were in the land of Egypt, that is when God sent a plague of hail just before the Exodus. And it destroyed the barley because the barley was Aviv. But it didn't hurt some of the other crops. Now, whatever the word Aviv means, it is, first of all, it's referring to a level of maturity of the barley crop. And so it was in the month of the Aviv barley we came out of the land of Egypt. And that's why he said, this shall be the beginning of the year for you, the beginning of months, for in the month of the Aviv you came out of the land of Egypt. The month of the Aviv, in which the barley was Aviv, and the hail came down and destroyed the barley because it was Aviv. So we have those parameters that are set for the beginning of the year. Now, we know that when we came into the land of Israel, that we were required to go up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Unleavened Bread every year in the month of the Aviv. And so when we went up to the Feast of Passover, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we were then to harvest 10 omer of the new barley crop. So the barley has got to be harvestable. It has to be mature and harvestable during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so we know that as early as 15 days earlier, that the barley must be Aviv. So whatever Aviv is, it means that as early as 15 days later, it's going to be harvestable. You may have to replay the tape a few times to get the full dynamics of what I'm talking about here, but I'll attempt to make it clear on this. Because whatever Aviv barley is, it means that 15 days later, it's going to be harvestable. That's the first month of the year. Now, we'll discuss that more in a little bit, but we see that the first month is called the month of the Aviv after the Babylonian captivity. It was also called Nisan. And that corresponds on the Gregorian, or as I affectionately call it, the pagan calendar, with the months of March and April. And then, of course, you have the second month, the month of Iyar, the third month, the month of Siwan. Now we come to the next month, the fourth month, and we have the month on the Jewish calendar, which is entitled the month of Tammuz. Now, what is the month of Tammuz about? Where did that name come from? Because we read in Ezekiel 8 how that God is taking Ezekiel into the back way into the temple. By revelation, that is when Ezekiel is busting through the wall and going in the back way, and God is telling him to dig deeper, let's see what's going on behind the scenes. He takes him into the temple and shows what is going on in the temple, and God says it's an abomination. Then he takes them further and he says, I'm going to show you an even greater abomination, and he shows them women weeping for Tammuz. Women weeping for Tammuz. This was an abomination. Now, who is Tammuz? Tammuz is the son of Semiramis, or Beltis, who was the wife of Nimrod. Nimrod is the man who built the Tower of Babel. And according to Babylonian sun god worship teaching, it was Nimrod, when he died, he ascended into heaven and he literally became the sun. Now he is the sun god, the Babylonian sun god. And his wife Semiramis, a great time later, she becomes pregnant. His widow becomes pregnant, but not in a way that you might expect. She becomes pregnant because the rays of the sun, her husband Nimrod, have impregnated her, and now she is going to give birth to the reborn sun god, and she calls his name Tammuz. And his birth date is December 25th. Now, this isn't any real news to the Israelites, because remember, we were down in Egypt, and the Egyptian sun god Ra, he was born on December 25th. And just about all sun god worship originated in Babylon. So when we were taken into captivity in Babylon, to have the Babylonian sun god born on December 25th, that would be common. And then, of course, many years later, when Antiochus Epiphanes came in and conquered Jerusalem, roasted a sow on the brazen altar, defiling the altar, and then he set up a statue of Zeus, the Greek sun god, in the temple on Zeus's birthday, December 25th. Many years later, the Romans had the habit of crucifying the Jews, torturing them to death on the cross of Mithra, the Mithraic cross, because Mithra was the Roman sun god, and you can look it up in the Encyclopedia Britannica and see that Mithra's birth date is December 25th. There's one day I'll guarantee you that Yahshua of Nazareth was not born. It's December 25th. This has all to do with pagan sun god worship. And yet we see this is what this whole thing about Tammuz is, and December 25th, and of course an older calendar, the the Julian calendar, in which December 25th occurred at the winter solstice. And so it is that Tammuz, the reborn sun god, lived for 40 years. In his 40 years, he was killed in a freak hunting accident, and he was gored by a wild boar. Now, after that, they then set aside 40 days of weeping for Tammuz, 1 day for each year of his life. So that's where the 40 days of weeping for Tammuz came about. But many years later, his mother, Semiramis, or Beltis, she died. But as luck would have it, she did not stay dead. When she ascended into the heavens, the gods sent her back to earth in this giant egg, which came down from heaven on the first Sunday at sunrise, after the vernal equinox, that Sunday sunrise, in which Easter, the goddess of fertility, came down out of heaven, landed in the Euphrates River, busted out, and turned a bird into an egg-laying rabbit. Astarte, Easter, the goddess of fertility, the naked fertility goddess of the East, was the reborn Semiramis, the wife of Nimrod, the mother of Tammuz. Now, it was then that they would set aside the 40 days of weeping for Tammuz that would culminate on Easter Sunday. And that was the day they would then kill the wild boar that killed Tammuz and eat ham on Easter Sunday. And of course, many years later, as the worship of Astarte or Easter developed, then the priest of Easter would impregnate virgins on the altar of Easter at the sunrise service, and 1 year later they would sacrifice those 3-month-old babies and then dye the eggs of Easter in the blood of those sacrificed infants. And even in America today and around the world, there's one denomination that only allows the eggs of Easter to be dyed blood red. If you ask them why, they have no idea, because they inherited it from their forefathers. But it goes right back to the sacrifice of infants and the worship of the sex fertility goddess of the East. But still, if you ask most denominations why they dye Easter eggs, they don't know that is the memorial, the rehearsal of child sacrifice. But yet, these are the kind of things that have been brought into what people call the worship of the true God, and is nothing but pagan sun god worship, and God calls it an abomination, and to have nothing to do with it, never naming the names of other gods, and not learning the way of the heathen. Do not learn how they worship and serve their gods, and say you're doing it unto me. It's an abomination. It is so repulsive and vile and disgusting that God has to use the hardest word in the Hebrew language. And yet I hear people say, well, that's not what it means to me. Well, again, it doesn't matter what it means to you. It matters what it means to God. And we serve the true God. And we do what He says. If we love Him, we keep His commandments. We do not throw other gods and put them in His face. So it is the month of Tammuz, and then we go down to take a look at the 7th month, the month of Ethanim, or as it's now called, the month of Tishri on your Jewish calendars, and you see that it is in accordance with the month of September. Sept September, sept means seventh. October, octagon, octo, eighth. November, novus, ninth. December, deca, 10th. Those 4 months harken back to God's original numbering of the month, whereas January starts out with Janus, the two-headed god of the Roman Empire, and then goes all the way to August, Caesar Augustus, the god of the Roman Empire. So it is that even on the pagan calendar, there is a little bit of a remembrance of God's original reckoning of time, even though the reckoning has completely changed. It's a year and a half ago that I said and wrote that Y2K is moot. It is totally irrelevant. December 31st, 1999 at midnight doesn't begin a day. It doesn't begin a week, doesn't begin a month, doesn't begin a year, doesn't begin a millennium. Even on the pagan calendar, the new millennium doesn't start till 2001. All that it possibly could have been is a 2-digit computer code problem. It had nothing to do with prophecy being fulfilled or God's prophetic timetable. And there were people saying that the Messiah is going to return on January 1st or at midnight. What ridiculous things. And then we hear 88 reasons why the Messiah is going to return on October 8th, 1988, and then we change it to 93 reasons why in 93. All of these things because we are ignorant of God's times and God's Moedim. We are to not be ignorant of those things, and we will never know the day or the hour of these occurrences. But we can know the times and seasons that we are allowed to know and restoring God's reckoning of time. Now when we come to the end of the year, I'll point this out that after 12 lunar months, which each month is 29 and a half days long, depending on the sighting of the first sliver of the new moon, it's either a 29-day month or a 30-day month. So after 12 months, you could have a year as short as 354 days. You could see how easily the solar calendar and the lunar calendar would get out of sync that way, seeing how there are 365 and a quarter days in the solar cycle. And so what God did is provided a way by which these things could be adjusted. And after the 12th month, then what we do is when the first sliver of the new moon appears, we have a question, what month is it? We'll go back to take a look at what month this could be. Because if the barley at the end of the 12th month, if the barley is now Aviv when the first sliver of the new moon appears, it is the month of the Aviv. But if the barley has not reached that level of maturity, the month is called Adar Bet, or a 13th month, to allow the barley to mature. Now this becomes very important in God's reckoning of time, especially on the prophetic calendar. We're going to see how that now begins to work out. Because now, when do years begin? They begin in the month of the Aviv barley. And on our calendar we see that Adar is the 12th month of the lunar year. The lunar month is 29 and a half days long, and the lunar year could be as short as 354 days. The solar year being 365 and a quarter, you have to synchronize the lunar and the solar calendars so that Passover is in the spring of the year in the month of the Aviv each year. And so the biblical Hebrew calendar requires a periodic 13th month to allow for the maturing of the barley crop in the land of Israel. That is where all time is reckoned from, Jerusalem. Now, at the appearance of the new moon after Adar, the barley must be Aviv for the new month to be declared the month of the Aviv. If it's not, it's declared Adar Bet. And last year, in 1999, in the spring, the new moon at the close of Adar was Adar Bet. Jewish Karaites found the barley in Israel that it was not Aviv, so an Adar Bet had to be calculated. Now the modern rabbinic calendar, or the Jewish calendar, calculates Adar Bet 7 times every 19 years, regardless of the barley in the land of Israel. And the calculation was put in place at a time that we didn't live in the land of Israel. So there's a reason why it was done. But now we are living in the land, and so we can go back to God's reckoning of time. Last year, the Jewish calendar was 1 month ahead of God's calendar, and it was this last fall that calculation in the reckoning was then made right.
Michael Rood will return with some closing thoughts in just a moment.
For 2,000 years, the biblical calendar has been in disarray. When Israel was ejected from this land by the Romans, it became problematic to maintain a correct calendar. It was difficult for a people who were scattered over 3 continents to determine the month of the Aviv barley in the land of Israel. The Jewish people then adopted a calculated calendar that approximated the month of the Aviv to determine when to keep the feast. But this calendar was based solely on calculation. The Roman calendar, which was dedicated to the Roman sun god, Sol Invictus Mithra, who was born on December 25th, was foisted upon the non-Jewish masses who were completely ignorant of the Creator's reckoning of time. The Roman Emperor Constantine expunged everything of Jewish or biblical origin from his government-authorized church and replaced it with the rituals and observances of Babylonian sun god worship. The ancient world plummeted into the Dark Ages, when ignorance and religious superstition reigned supreme for more than a millennium. The biblical calendar was seemingly lost to antiquity. However, since Israel became a nation again in 1948, there has been a revival of the Creator's reckoning of time in the land of Israel. Instantaneous worldwide communications have made it possible for everyone to be alerted to the beginning of the biblical months and years. We are no longer unaware of the Creator's times and seasons, unless we choose to continue living in ignorance. We invite you to join us again next time for Episode 7 in the 26-part series on the prophecies in the Feast of the Lord, the Sabbath, the day or millennium of the Lord. This is Michael Rood from Jerusalem bidding you shalom, peace, and I'll see you when the smoke clears.